Hello and welcome. Okay, so what you're going to find is a picture. Obviously, this was made for a good friend of mine, and it's gone. So the best thing I can do for you is make a photocopy of it. But when I had a friend of mine do some wood cutting for me, I made him some shapes right out of the sheets that you can buy to do photocopies. So the template is basically the shape and size of the actual piece of wood. Okay, so you can go out and pick up some of these pieces of wood at dollar stores. That's where I picked up this one. Okay, it was only $2. It had a little hole to hang already. Okay, and these were already made Michaels or like I said, I found some good stuff at a dollar store. But I did, like I said, I did have a friend of mine that cut me up some pieces. And since I moved, I don't have that option anymore. So I'm trying to talk my husband here to find some time to cut wood for me. Yeah, so you can buy these little kits at the dollar store or hardware store as well, and then just nail on your little hangers. Okay, but what I was noticing, like going out to buy some light pine wood, you don't want real heavy ash or anything like that, depending on the size of your piece. And pine is very cheap, but if you see, the grain is very boring. All right, it's wood, yes, but it's very boring. And this is where I came up with adding a little bit more of my own 2 cents to create a faux wood. Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of an example of some stuff I was playing on and getting them ready for some signs. And I may still add to this or paint over it, or like I did a bunch of them all at the same time one day, playing around with different stains. I made a wash with our multi-surface paint. And then also there is a few kits that you can buy. Okay, antiquing medium. And that's quite nice too. But you can make your own antiquing medium by just adding floating medium and making a real inky type color and floating it over the wood. And the wood is going to really absorb it. So you can see that this wood did have a few interesting kind of lines and a very simple knot in there. All right. And so this is what I like to look at when I'm creating faux wood. Okay, it's just not enough emphasis on the grain. Okay, so you can go out and buy some really expensive wood. So once in a while you'll get some interesting knots and stuff like that to have in these cheap pine boards. But like I said, this is what I'm trying to create, is a little bit of an illusion of maybe oak. Okay, a little bit more better. Now this one here on the side is, again, another piece of board that I was playing around with stain. Just simple stripes. This one actually broke. And so I'm just using it as an example here to play around with a little bit to show you real grain, okay? And so there is so many different options and varieties and styles of wood, okay? And you can see how sometimes they just come in with some just different little centers of knots, all right, of all the different grains. So this is what we're going to play around with today, trying to create a little bit more interesting wood style, okay, on our cheap pine boards. You could also paint this on a small canvas, okay, and create a wood look on a canvas, or whatever you like. You don't always have to paint on wood. All right, so just keep that in mind when you're doing this project, that you can create a wood look on anything. All right, so that's what we're going to play with today. Okay, so to start off, I just use any sponge, really. Okay, so it depends on where you get them. There's a variety of them, even if you have nice sea sponges. It doesn't really matter. A kitchen sponge will work, okay? You can even take some scissors and cut them and make a little bit of a round on them. Or this is an old one, but this is one of my favorites, is from the Donna Dewberry sponge collection. She's got 2 of them. One's a little bit larger than the other, one's got a point to it. Okay, so if you happen to come across these, In the States, you can order them from Donna Dewberry yourself, or you can order them through me. If I don't have them in stock, I will order them in for you and get them here for you in Canada. Alrighty. So that's what we're going to play with today, is just a little bit of a sponge technique to get them started. And what I'm going to do is just show you on paper. Okay. So depending on what colors you want to use, you can use a true brown or you can use a burnt umber. It really is up to you depending on how warm you want the look. Okay, so these are a lot of the wood colors that are, you know, very popular to use. Okay, depending on how what colors, how light you want to make them. All right, I put the colors that I used in the e-pack, but I just want to put it out there that you could use any colors. Okay, so it depends on what kind of brown you have. The real brown and the burnt umber are our choices for dark browns. The real brown is just cooler brown with more gray tones, and then the burnt umber is a little bit more warmer brown. Okay, so if you only have one brown and it's more gray tone, you could always add a little bit of yellow ochre in there or cinnamon in there. Okay, and then the camel is really nice too if you want to keep it a little bit more a cooler tone. Okay, so I play with all of these different colors. It all really depends on what kind of color of wood are you trying to mimic. You know, you can even pop in a little bit of engine red in there if you want to try and do like a cherry wood or something like that, or a little bit of berry wine would give it a definitely a warmer, richer red look. So yeah, it's all about, you know, the tones that you want to create. Okay, and then the actual effect of it all. Okay, so I'm going to share the effect with you, and I'm just going to use my camel and my burnt umber and my white to show you in these examples. Okay, and then we're going to show you our quick one-stroke leaf, how I did a few little pine needles, and then of course our acorns that we popped in. Alright, so if you're not comfortable with doing a freehand technique with your letters, I have given you a pattern. Okay, so you can just use some graphite paper, alright, and pencil right over mine, and it'll copy it right over your canvas or a piece of wood or whatever you want to make. Right, and if you need a little bit more help with placement, then you can always just lightly trace over my existing design, but please feel free to make your own. Okay, once you feel comfortable with the stroke work, maybe you have a bigger canvas and you want to add 5 acorns. You know, you can build off of this pattern very easily and extend it up a little bit higher once you get the idea of doing all of these techniques to build the basic one here in the small version. Right, so try to stay open-minded that you can recreate this. Okay, use different color combinations if you like, and change them up if you want. You can even make this more Christmassy by adding some poinsettia leaves and some red little berries on there. Alright, so there's lots of things that you can do and create from this pattern. And then I'm also going to be adding the written instructions for you, so that if you're not able to come here and visit the video, and you understand the process, you just need something to guide you, then you have the e-pack on the side that you'll be able to work with as well. Alright, so we're going to put some paint on our palette. When they start to get a little bit empty, I like to store them all upside down, so it's easier to get the paint out of there. And a little bit of white. And I'm going to brighten some areas up a little tiny bit. And we also want a damp sponge. Okay, so a lot of times I'll only dampen half of the sponge. All right, and then squeeze it out good, so then that way it's not dripping all over the place like it is all over my piece of paper here. Okay, so I'm going to try and do it on this printer paper here on the white so that you can see it. And hopefully it won't curl up on me too badly. So you want to double load your sponge. Okay. So you're going to pick up a little tiny bit of dark on the one side and a little bit of camel on the other side. And then blend them together on your palette. And you definitely want it to be fairly runny, okay? So just in case you feel like it's dry while you do a few strokes, you can control floating medium a lot better than you can dipping your sponge back into water, okay? You can always add just a little tiny bit of floating medium in there if you feel like your sponge is not wet enough. Right? And what we're going to do is, it depends on if you want to do them all vertically, say you want to do some fence boards, then you're going to do all your stripes up and down. But if you want to do the sign like I did on a piece of just a small signboard, you're going to do all your little strokes sideways. Okay? So you're just going to make some random, cover up all of your background, okay? And cover it all good. And if you feel like it's too translucent, okay, let this dry and do another coat over it. Okay, so wood usually will need a good 2 coats. And you can always give it a little sanding in between each coat, because sometimes wood is a little bit bumpy and rough. So if you feel like it's a little bit rough, then definitely sand your wood before you paint, and then you could always add another little coat of paint and then sand it again to make it even smoother, and then put another coat. You might think I'm a little bit crazy here, but I am a retired nail technician, and I had a bunch of these little buffer boards, okay? And it was like 100, 180 at one time. This is definitely too coarse on this one side, but this side is a lot nicer and softer, so it's like a fine buffer. Okay, you can buy the blocks at the hardware store, but they come in fine, medium, and coarse. So make sure that if you're doing a quick little buff on top of your paint, to make sure that you buy the fine ones. And even a brand new one is going to be very strong. Okay, so you can almost take off some of the grit on something else first, just to kind of soften it a little bit, to take off any of the strong coarseness of it, because a lot of times they're imperfect and they will come with little bits that are a little higher raised, and when you go to sand something, you might have a strong scratch mark in there. So in the nail industry, when they're brand new like that, if we started filing on our nails, they'd be very sharp and possibly cut our skin. So what we do is we sometimes take another file and we just season it a little bit, is what we call it. And you can just soften a file with another file. Okay, so you're going to just kind of soften it a little bit, use it a little bit, so that it's not so brand new, and then it'll be a little bit more softer to sand down your wooden pieces. Okay, so just wanted to give you a little bit of a trick to kind of show you about the seasoning part. And like I said, if you bought one of these brand new fine and you have your piece that's wood and you sand it all down first, wash it down with a damp towel to get all the dust off, then you paint it. By the time you go and do another little sanding, you've already used it a little bit. Okay, but I'm just saying that if you feel like your sandpaper is too rough, then just season it a little bit. Okay, so just kind of using it up a little bit, because this one here is actually a medium and it's way too strong. So you definitely want a fine buffer, okay, so you don't leave scratch marks in your wood. Okay. So what we want to do when we're putting these stripes on is to try to have bigger areas, okay, and some smaller areas. So move down so that you're getting, you know, different randomness of streaks throughout your background. Okay, and you don't even have to have, like, you can have some dark areas over here, dark over here, okay, and just soften them out a little bit. If you want to brighten things up a little bit, you can always add a little bit of white and add a few streaks of light in there. Okay, you see how I'm just randomly kind of popping them up, a little bit jaggedy here and there. Okay, and let this dry. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this as flat as possible. Another thing you can do too when you're playing on just plain paper, if you don't want it to curl up while it's wet, is tape it down to your table with some painter's tape, and then let it dry before you take the tape off. Okay, and try not to go over it too many times, and remember, this is just practice. Let's see if this can give me a little bit flatter piece of paper. Bubbling up a little bit on me. Okay. But you'll also see I have some step-by-step pictures that I took when I was creating the piece in your e-pack, that you will see the actual process and steps as well. Okay, so when you're done with your sponge, make sure you put it in some water until you're able to bring it to the sink and put some soap in there and rinse it out really well. Okay. So the technique of the wood grain, now depending on where your colors are, you know, every one is going to be different. It's like snowflakes, right? No two pieces of wood are going to be the same unless they're cut off the same tree, and then they may have some similarities. But what we're going to do now is take advantage of some of these tones that you have going on already. Okay, so where there is some lighter areas and darker areas, we can add a little bit more of a tone to it. Okay, so what the first thing I'm doing is just dampening my brush in a floating medium. Okay, then I'm going over and picking up just a tiny bit of the burnt umber. Blend it on your palette. Okay. And then we're just going to really softly add some streaks into there. So just under that light one, I'm going to add a random little curl and then sweep it right out of there. Then I can go inside it and add another little soft one. And then make them a little bit jaggedy. And then fade it into nothing. If you want to do it all the way around, you can make a whole little knot. Okay, you see how you want to blend it in some areas. Okay, so right where I went over that light area, it wasn't really looking like it was natural, so I kind of like took it out and then just raised it up a little bit higher. Okay, so they don't always have to be connected. Okay. Putting some randomness in there. And then here's a good shaded area. I'm going to emphasize that a little bit more. Okay, so you can flip your brush upside down. Okay. or you can use it, you know, at the top. It just depends on where you want your look to emphasize. I really don't want to take away that lightness there, right? So I'm going to shade just on top of it, okay, and then feather it out. Okay, so you can always add some soft strokes in there. Emphasize those dark areas that are already there. You can see sometimes a little bit skimpy, that's okay. But just try to soften it out. Add a little bit more floating medium if they're a little bit too jaggedy, too dry. Okay, you want it to be a nice smooth look. And wherever it's has some shading going on, you want to just emphasize those dark areas and try to leave some light areas. Okay. Very random. Okay, so usually I do the outside ones first, and then I'll tuck a little one in. But you can always add to it, right? Just a little bit. So that's basically how you do a knot. And then if you want to emphasize your highlighted areas, you're just going to clean your brush and do the same thing with your white and just kind of add a few highlights here and there. Brighten things up a bit. Okay. You can turn your brush upside down and then put a highlight right along a dark mark. Okay. Use your fingers to feather that out. And sometimes doing a highlight just on top of, just underneath the dark, or just on top of it, is going to emphasize that dark a little bit more. You don't want it to be too white. Okay, that was a little bit too white. Always pick up a tiny little bit of that camel and soften it back out again if you feel like it's too light. You can always go back in and make them a little darker if you feel like it's not dark enough. And the third one, move them in a little bit more. Again, a little bit more. And just very faint in the middle. So that's basically the movement. I just want to feather them in there. Okay, we're going to start off with some simple warm-up, one stroke leaves, and what I used in this design was sap and lime green. You can see I'm running out of my sap. And you're going to need a little bit of marigold, but not a lot. Just, you know, I just picked up a tiny little bit of the marigold just every once in a while on a couple leaves, just to make things a little bit different looking and brighten it up a bit. Okay, so let's take my lid right off. Sometimes when it gets to this point. So everything is very slow moving sometimes when you have to order things from the States. And but it's not a bad thing, because sometimes when you're starting to run out of colors, you can have to get more creative and start making your own colors. So I do have my favorite 12 listed now. That if you have a limited palette, it has all my favorite colors. I shared it on my group on Facebook. And it's there for you guys if you missed it. And yeah, so you can just pick up you. And I like a medium or dark kind of color of all the crayon colors. And then I can always make them lighter and I can always make them darker, right? So I did list Thicket as my go-to for most of the time because I can add a little bit of cobalt blue into that, or I can, you know, change it up a little bit. Oops, I picked up my marigold there. All right, so let's rinse that brush out just a little bit there on a towel and pick up some of that lime green. I've already made my lime green a little bit more brighter. Okay, so I told you guys before, if you haven't heard it, I'm a little bit dyslexic. It's from hanging around left-handed people for too long. Just a joke for all my southpaw people. I love you. I always try to consider you, and hopefully that you're happy with, you know, most of my practice courses all have the left-handed versions as well, so meaning that what is most comfortable for you to do the stroke. Most of us are right-handed, and you know, we're gonna easily, you know, write from left to right. But when it comes to southpaws, you know, they're feeling a little bit backwards, right? And sometimes it's harder to push as opposed to pull towards you. So you're going to pull towards your body very easily this way, where if you're right-handed, you're going to pull very easily to this way. So basically your one stroke leaf is just starting on your chisel, slide a little bit, and a little bit gradually put pressure as you're coming about midway up. Then you're going to start lifting up on your pressure to come up right up on your chisel again and slide it up a little bit to make it interesting. Right, so it's a little bit like an S kind of movement. So you're down and flatten out and then slightly up. Okay. You can see on the cardstock it's very dry. I didn't go all the way to my stop point. I can just go over it again, make it a little tiny bit longer, and slide her up. A little closer for you guys. So it's always good to have a stop point in mind. Like even myself, if I really want to discipline myself, I don't want to make this too long, so I'll give myself a stop point. If you want it to be a slider leaf, then you're going to make it out a little bit longer. Okay, and then that'll guide you to where do I want to stop. Okay, you're always going to wisp it in on your chisel, get that nice little point, slide it along, and then about halfway through where your stop point is where your thickest part is. Okay. So you can see that my brush is not loaded very good in the very middle because it's skimped right out on me. So that means I have to add way more paint and really push hard, get that paint pushed all the way up. Okay. So I try to, when I do leaves, I try to do like a 3/4 kind of gradient. Okay, and you can see how's it doing. It's still giving me a bit of a hard time. So if you're working on fabric or wood, even is a little bit dry sometimes. If you're having a hard time, help it along. Just kind of like push it in there, and then start over at the beginning, and then smooth out that stroke. Okay, so this is how I fight with certain textures, okay, different surfaces. If you're painting on glass, it's going to be super easy. It's going to slip right through and you're going to be able to do lots of strokes. But when you're working on drier surfaces, you definitely got to push it a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a warm-up stroke here to show you the 3/4 gradient. Turn that in there, get it in there. Okay, so you can see that my dark is quite up there. And then if I want to add just a little bit of yellow as my highlight instead of white, okay, I'm going to add just that little tiny bit of yellow into my lime green. And brighten things up a bit more. Okay. And you can always add more paint and then tip it up with a little bit of white. Okay. That gives you some different variations of greenery. Okay, so try to change it up a little bit. And if you're doing any in the back and you're going to layer another leaf on top, you definitely want to add a little bit more white into that one, so then that way it stands out compared to the one that's in the background. Okay. When you're doing some stems and the vein, you know, you're just gonna put lots of floating medium and give yourself, you know, some variety of stems. Okay. And then you're gonna work your way, you know, down as well and around. Oops, sorry about that, guys. Come a little bit further away from me again. There we go. That way I don't get myself in trouble going off screen. Okay. So this is what I did, is I just started off with a, you know, basic, using your chisel to draw the line. Okay. And then you can start off anywhere at the top, okay, and add your leaves. And I tried to leave some spaces here at the base of it for the main part of the design, right? And then to make them a little bit different, you can do a little bit of your stem at the same time, drag your brush a little bit longer, and then have some different direction. Okay, so you can always just put them all there where you want them, and then you'll be able to come back and add a little highlight to them later if you want. Okay, so for you southpaws, or if you want a leaf to go into a different direction, you know, you got to practice that different leaf. Okay, practice on both sides. A little bit more yellow. Getting too dark, and brighten it up. You don't always have to use white to highlight things. I really like the streakiness about that, but I just didn't like the way it finished. Okay. And with leaves, if you have a few streakiness going through there, that's not a bad thing. And then sometimes if I do make a little bit of a mistake or a messiness, if you're not going to layer another leaf right on top of it, you can always just use the back side of your brush and just neaten that up a bit. Okay. If your leaves are looking fairly light, then you're going to want your stem to be dark through it. But if your leaves are fairly dark looking, you're going to want to flip your brush around to get your stem to look lighter inside your leaf. So it really just depends on which direction do you start with. Okay, so either you're light or you're dark. Okay, and it's basically the same thing as doing these little stems, but you're just doing them smaller. Okay, so this is fairly dark, so I want to start with the same color that is dominant. Okay, so if it's dominantly dark, I want to start with dark, and then you're just going to push a little bit and flick right out. Okay, to put that stem right in the middle there. Okay, again, even though I just started here, you can always come all the way back over here into your stem and then slide that in to put your stem in there. If it's not showing up enough, then maybe just add just a tiny little bit of white into your stems compared to, right? And you'll see that's a lot brighter. Okay, so I'll just brighten this up here a little bit for you here. Okay, so you guys can see the little ticks I have on the practice sheet. Okay. Want them in all directions. So just practice all of your different directions. Okay. Get a little bit slimmer on some are a little bit chubbier. Okay. So if I didn't say it before, this is just practicing with a number 12 flat. And you also want to downsize too. You can always go down to an 8 and add a couple smaller ones. Okay. I always say go over to a new pile to make your blend with a smaller brush, and you got to be even more focused to get your blending going back and forth even more. The smaller the brush, the more you got to focus. Okay, so you can always add some smaller ones. We'll look closer. I like sometimes a little streakiness going on. I made that one a little bit longer. We can make them a little bit shorter. You should always practice what you can make the biggest and the smallest with the same brush. Okay. If you haven't jumped on any of my other courses, you'll see that I recommend that a lot, and I also recommend practicing in all directions. If you have to keep moving your canvas around to get those strokes in the beginning, that's okay, but really try to focus on practicing all of the different directions, trying to pull that leaf down and up in different directions, and you'll see that you'll get a little different dance with every leaf, as opposed to just keep mimicking, and then you become a photocopier. When you do that, you tend to make the same exact style, but when you force yourself to push it down and sideways and up in different directions, it really does add a little bit more of a dance into your leaf. Okay, so when I did the little pine needles, okay, I stuck basically with the lime and the sap just to make them look a little darker and a little different compared to everything else. Okay, so again, it's just making all these little wisps like you did with your vein. Right, so I start off with a bunch of darker ones. Okay, flick them out, and then a little bit smaller as you work to the outside. Then I'll flip my brush and do some light ones on top. Okay, a little bit later, a little bit later. And if you want to add just a smidgen of white, just on a couple, you can. Okay, so you're not going to put very much, right? You don't want them to be strong. Okay, so that's basically our little, you can do some in that direction, some back here, some over here. Okay, that's basically the same thing as your little wisps. My brush is falling apart. Okay, so look it out. Couple little examples here. Okay. Dark, medium, okay, and then your light. Yeah. You can jump down with your leaves and make them all a little bit different. You do one with a 12, one with a 10, one with an 8. But like I said, if you play around with your pressure, you'll be able to create different size leaves with just 2 different size brushes. Okay, so basically you can use a 12 and an 8 is what I suggest. And don't even use the 10. Really push yourself to try and create that leaf with like a 10, and then really push that 8 to make a leaf that looks like a 10 again. Does that make sense? Hope it does. And then we have our acorns. So for that, I went down to a size 8 brush. All I used was the burnt umber in white. Okay. If you want to add just a smidgen of camel in there just to soften things up, but basically it's a dirty white. Okay. And then when you have a dirty white going on, every time you go to pick up your paint, okay, you're going to pick up a tiny little bit of white every single time. Smallest amount, a little bit. Okay. So then that way you're creating your highlight at the same time. There's sort of like a teardrop stroke, but it's sort of like a inverted U. But not too wide. And you're basically going, and I tried to make them all a little bit different depending if, making them look like they're tilted this way or that way by the beginning strokes here. But basically, you're going to brick layer them. Okay. You can put 2, kind of beside each other. Right. And you don't mind if the back ones are a little bit darker. Okay. You don't have to go too light at this stage. Okay. If you feel like you don't have enough coverage on here, you're going to have to start all over again. Okay. So make sure that you're always happy with this back petal before you go on to the next one. Okay. I'm going to show a dirty white one for the back here. Okay, so the back row can be, just your dirty white. And then as you get closer, keep picking up more white, and then you're going to brick layer them, so then there's going to be a little bit more of a straighter pattern now. Okay. And do 3. Okay. Then you're going to go over to the side and add a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter white, a little at a time. Okay. So if you want to do 2, 3 acorns all at the same time, see, I don't have good coverage here. What I'll do is I'll just go do a couple other acorns. And you always do at least, 2 or 3. You're not going to just do one by itself. And then come back when it's dry and just pop it up a little bit more. If you know me by now, you'll know that I'm a big nut for having that coverage and opacity. My fancy word for that. And then again, you're going to start coming a little bit on an angle, okay? So it forces it to pop out. Okay, so this one is going to be on this side a little bit. Okay, making sure your gradient is right up there too. Okay, so here's a couple little marks for you. Okay, a dirty white. Oh, picking up green there. Okay, and then a little brighter white. Some yellow in there. You can see that they're getting a little brighter and a little lighter. Okay. A little bit of floating medium in there every once in a while. So I'm focusing getting that dark right in there. And then now you're going to reverse, okay? So you're going to come down and come back to the 3 again, 4 again. Okay. And then move yourself down smaller. And smaller. Okay. And these ones definitely want to be a little bit brighter. Okay. That's another way of doing them is finishing them off like that. Okay. Up there. And I finished the last one in one big row. Okay. You can do them backwards. The lefty. Okay, so when you do your last row, I bring down some color, a little bit lower. And bring it down a little bit more. So that you're really bringing them down. And then again, making them look really interesting, just do them in the other direction, and it'll spin it over onto the other way. And same as your leaves, makes them look a little bit different too. And then what you can do is just pick up some brown, okay, and just kind of make your shape at the bottom. Fill this in. Okay. And you're just going to work that right into the bottom. And if you feel like you want to go over your little guys again, you know, you can always do that. But you want them to feather in to the base. Okay, so you're making it a little bit darker down here. And you can see that I'm just using the one side of my brush to kind of paint that in, just to darken it. And if I pick up the odd little white streak through it, it's not a bad thing. Okay. So again, just feathering that in. Okay. With the corner of your brush. And then slide in a little bit of a them. Okay. You could always use a number 6 too. If you really want to make them tiny, just keep downsizing your brush to different sizes. But for the practice, it's great to do it a little bit bigger, and then you can always move yourself down to a number 6. Make them really tiny. I'll give you a couple little examples with my number 6. When you're double loading smaller brushes, a little bit different process, okay? So what I'll do is I actually pull it towards myself and then flip my brush over, and then I can always move my brush into that pile and out of that pile a little bit more to adjust my gradient. You just got to be really focused on your blending, okay? And where you're picking it up, okay? So I'm kind of going right over that brown pile, both directions. Okay, so there's my muddy white. Okay, a lot of people hate when they have muddy colors, but this is how you're gonna get out of it, is by popping up that white just a smidgen. Okay, stay out of that dirty green. Okay, if your paint is starting to dry, it's going to be harder to pick up that little bit of a bubble. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll just clean out an area, okay, because it's got like a skim of dryness starting, right? So skim out that top layer, and now when you go to pick up your fresh paint, you'll be able to actually control it more. So that is probably one of the biggest things that most people have a problem with, and that is the biggest little trick that I can share with you, is that just get rid of that dry skimmy paint, okay? Because it's been sitting there for a little while. You've been practicing for a good 20 minutes, half an hour, so it's starting to dry if you forgot about it. Same thing over here. My green has been sitting there for a long time, and I need to do a couple more leaves. I need to wake it up a bit. So what I do sometimes too to wake it up is I'll just put the smallest amount of floating medium in there if it's gone too thick, and soften it all up again so that it's behaving again, right? But not too much, because you can really make it too runny. Okay, so this is just for paint that's too thick, and then when you go to do your stroke work, now it's going to be the right consistency for you to just go ahead and tip and blend and paint. Alright, so I hope that's a little extra little trick for you. Okay, so then we go back to our blending here. I took a bit of time and my brush probably got a little dry. Okay. So every single time when you're working with a smaller brush, you're really depending on that little bit of white. Okay, so you're just going to make them a little bit smaller. Right, overlap a couple. Yeah, every single time you'll see that you'll get a much better stroke. Okay. And you'll see that there's usually, I made what, about 5 rows. Okay, so you want to just make sure that you have it wider and wider. Right? You definitely want to start off with it. But some of them I just did it like that. Some of them I made a little bit more pointy. Okay? And then what I did is I went down one and some of them in another project that I did once. I keep trying to do that as well. So it's up to you on the angle that you want to do them. Okay? You can always come down one. Right? Get a little bit of coverage there. Bring up my gradient a little bit more. Because you really want to see that dark in between each stroke. So if your gradient is not up there, then you won't see that darkness behind it. Okay. And let's go over it again. Make sure that it's up there. So I hope you like this little quickie. You get to see me make the practice sheet. And I'll have arrows on here and I'll have the colors labeled for you, and then you'll be able to pop them into a plastic sleeve and practice right over my strokes, or put some wax paper over the printout if you want as well, and then you can keep them. Happy painting! Can't wait to see your versions of your welcome signs. Please share them on the group. I want to talk about a little bit about the sign that we're going to paint. You got a little bit about what surfaces you can paint on, and how to prepare them. So if you have some sandpaper, sometimes when you first cut these pieces, they're a little bit rough. So make sure you sand them all down. Even when you buy the cheap ones at the dollar store with some of those signs, they're a little bit rough. They're not totally finished. So just give them a nice little buff so that they're nice and smooth. And then when you go to put your first base coat on, then it's gonna sit a lot nicer for you. But because when you're painting on wood, wood is usually very absorbent, and you usually need a good 2 coats to give it a nice coverage. And I have these little buffers that I showed you in the video, my little nail boards, right? So at this process here, if you feel like there's any bumps or anything that you don't like, you can always just give it a tiny bit of a buff just to make sure that it's nice and smooth for you. And that would be like the finish from your paint. If it's not smooth or for any reason, you can always give it a nice little buff, and it didn't hurt the board at all, just with a soft buffer, right? And then now when we go to do our actual details and our feature for it, then that's going to sit on there really nicely for you. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is put some faux wood on there. And if you have any kind of brown, like a true brown or a burnt umber is what I use. Okay. You'll see that Zoom recordings are not as nice as my other pre-recorded, and that's why I like doing them pre-recorded now, because I can never depend on the recording the same way, because the more people you have joining you live, the bandwidth gets a little bit crazy, and sometimes it's not as clear as a pre-recorded video. So you guys are going to really like the pre-recorded stuff that I have now with all the packs. So what we want to do is double load our sponge. Okay, so we're going to tip a little bit into our camel, and we're going to tip a little bit into our burnt umber, and then we're going to start blending it in the middle here and start getting a little bit of a gradient going on. And because we've already base coated our wood or canvas board, then you're going to be able to cover it really easy, and you're not going to really need a lot of the camo. So what we're going to do is start laying this down, but sideways, okay? And we have our light on the top, and our dark is at the bottom. So if you're working at the top and you're working your way down, the light is going to slightly overlap the dark as you go down. If you're left-handed, you're going to do it the other way around. But make sure that you have your light on the top, and you're going to work your way down. And we don't need a lot of dark, okay? So you just want, these little stripy patterns. And if you wanted to do this with more reds or berry wine is nice too, you can add it in there and make it look more like a cherry wood. And you just want to skimp really back and forth, just casually, just randomly, okay? So basically that's done. That's how fast and easy that start of a process should be, okay? So it really depends on how dark you want it. Okay, you can just flick a tiny little bit more darkness back in there. Okay, so you want these random little strokes to be, here and there, and we're going to emphasize them freehand with our big flat brush. Okay, so if you want to do around the sides of your, give it a little bit of a character there in there too. You can always add a little bit of just a little darkness here and there. See, I just kind of skimped it in the middle. Right, just enough to kind of see it on the side. But you want your wood to be on the side. Your green all has to be coming out, so just be careful when you're going around the sides. Okay, so I like that dark spot there. So we can always make a nice dark spot there. So we have some randomness. And this is where you want most of your extra little details, is around the edges, because by the time you put your words on here and start putting, all your little greenery, then you're gonna cover all your beautiful work, right? So I'm not worrying too much about up here and in the middle too much, but you're gonna see a little hint of it throughout the words as well. Okay. So you pop your sponge into your water so that makes sure that it doesn't dry out on you. And really, we don't need much cameo, so I put way too much on my plate, so you can scoop up most of it and put it back in your bottle. Because we really don't need any more cameo. If we're going to add a few highlights to it now, we can pop a little bit of that vintage white in. And if you don't have vintage white, basically it's like a very soft hint of brown inside that. So just dirty a white with a little tiny bit of brown, and you'll create that vintage white. Okay, so we want this to dry fairly good. And a little bit of a skimp of color shouldn't take too long. Also, I do want to show you guys some transfer paper. Okay, if you decided you wanted to make your piece really dark, you want to be a really dark finish, you can do that too. And then you're going to play around with your light cameo in reverse to create your lines and your effects. If you want to do it darker and then come lighter with your vein, okay? So try to look at different pieces of wood. As you can see, this one's a little bit more reversed with light as your highlight. So if you're doing something this dark and you go and use your transfer on it, it's going to be really hard to see. Okay, I used my nail there just to make a mark. It's going to be a little bit hard to see. So if you use white, okay, it's going to show up a lot nicer for you. So hopefully you can find yourself some white transfer so that when you're doing dark pieces, a little collection here. So this is one company here, graphite paper. It used to be called carbon paper, but now they're calling it graphite paper. And it comes in black, gray, or white. So I wouldn't worry about the gray. If you see the gray option and you have the black option, get the black, because that'll stand out a lot nicer for you. I don't know if anybody remembers Grandin Toy. This is how old this piece of paper, this little collection I had of carbon paper of his. I'm a hoarder, I told you. I save everything. There's still good paper in there. It's copy paper. So, yeah, that's what I suggest. If you do decide to get, to make your wood grain darker, say you like a darker look, then definitely feel free to reverse what we're basically doing. And you can see that I have some pictures of what my sign looked like before, and then after when I added the extra little veins. Okay, and then again with the words, starting with the words and all the placement of what you need to do. Okay, and then I also made another sign. Now, showing you a smaller sign, and it won't have as much room for all the ivy, but if you just wanted to make a simple sign with just the words welcome, you know, you could. This is another sign that I did. I actually made her a bucket too, and this was the lid that I made for her. I put a little knob in there from a doorknob, and she had a lid for her bucket. But I did the faux work, the woodwork on it too. So you can see that I have another little example of different knots there for you. Then you have this at least now, okay? So this is pretty dry now. Okay, it shouldn't take too long. So what I suggest is if you have some painter's tape. So if you don't want it to move on you, right? So what I do is I tape down my paper where I want it. And figure out where do you want your words. You can always add to it if you're using a bigger piece of paper. You can always add another branch and add some more leaves to this. Okay, this is just like a starter kind of pattern, right? So you figure out where you want your words in the middle here. Okay. If you really want to measure it out to make sure that it's even, you know, you can always try to make a line here so that you're not the W, just the little letters, so they're all straight. And then you can guide your template maybe a little bit. This one is very see-through, yours won't be. But basically in the middle here and off to the side a little bit. Okay. And then just taper down so it doesn't move on you. Okay. And I usually only tape one side, or I'll tape maybe with this side. I don't tape this side and I don't tape the bottom. Because that way you can just slide your carbon paper in there. Okay, and if you want to check things out and see how you're doing, you can always, you know, just take a peek underneath and make sure that it's working for you. So I'm not sure if you guys have done a lot of work with transferring. I'm going to share some extra little insight with you guys here tonight. You can make your own words if you want. You go on your Word document, you open it up, and you type whatever you want. If you want to have your family name or whatever, a little trick for you is that you can go and create your own words, pick your font, explode it really big on your piece of paper, print it out, right? And then you can always add, you know, welcome to the Joneses homes or whatever you want to add to it. If your sign's that big and you want to add more words, I just want to let you know that this is how I started mine in the first place, was through a Word document. And I do share that with in a couple of my courses. I have another family sign course that's available. And I shared with you there how I did the template, and then I added the rest of the design on after. Okay, so if you want to start with mine, that's great. Or if you want to change the font, maybe you like a little different font, you know, feel free to make your own off of a Word document. Okay, so for those who never knew you can do that, I know there's a few people that know they can do that. But for a few that don't know that, and it's just basically the same thing. You print it off, and then you use some carbon paper, and you just transfer it. And I don't worry too much about exact, because I know with my brush I can make lines a little bit neater, or like here, this, oh, I did a blurry line here for you. Just try to make it neat. And just go through the whole pattern and transfer it onto your design, or onto your piece. Okay, so you can always just leave it like that. Right. Oh, I forgot part of my M. Slip that back in there. So with the tape, your main one taped, it's really easy for me to come in there and just see if I forgot anything. Okay. So this one is a little bit bigger than the other one. So if I wanted to move my acorns over a little bit more, I can. You know, but you can put a couple odd little branches here and there just to guide you around the words if you want. Okay, but you don't have to do every little leaf, because maybe you'll add more leaves. Okay, and then also I did a lot of big ones, so if you want, you can add some more smaller ones around it too. So I always encourage you guys to make it your own, and hopefully that they'll all look slightly a little bit different. Okay. I'm not going to worry too much about my greenery there, because I'm going to just go ahead and place it so I can spread it out nicely, because this one is definitely bigger than the one that I made originally. But I do want it to kind of come around into the words and around it. Okay. So that'll give me a little bit of a starter, even if you just want to start with just the veins. Okay, so this will give you a little bit of an idea of where your words are and where you want to emphasize and add to it, okay? So we can do our detail of our burnt umber, make these a little bit more interesting around it, okay? So we're going to float a little bit of burnt umber on just on one corner, and I always find use a bigger brush is easier to get just that little bit of a line. Because the smaller your brush is, the harder it is to get very, very, very little bit on that edge just to create that soft line. You want just that little tiny bit of a line. And if you add some floating medium, you guys all know what floating medium is? It's just the fluff that's in the paint. This is Crackle. Guess what I was playing with last? There we are, floating medium. It's just the fluff that's in the paint, liquid part without no color in it. Okay, so just pop a little bit of that to the side. All right, so you can see that floating medium there. And then you blend that in there. So then now you're just picking up just that little bit on the edge of your brush. Okay. And the more floating medium you keep adding, it'll start to thin it out. Okay, so if you feel like it's too heavy, you can always thin it out really quickly. If it's still wet, you can still move it. Okay, so wherever it's dark, you just want to add a little bit more darkness to it. Okay, move off the edge, and then just make it a little bit random, and then bring it in. Okay. So they're all going to be slightly different. You pick your piece, your areas that you feel like, you know, you have some shading, the darkest areas. Okay. Add a few straight lines there. just emphasize some of those dark areas. And like I said, up here, we're not going to worry too much about it, but you can just add a couple interesting lines in there. So then that way, if you do have some spaces open, that you're going to see a few grains in there. Okay, so right at the top a little bit, you know, just scatter them here and there. Okay. And just keep adding a little bit of floating medium to your brush. And it'll slide right across. And this is where you can add your depth and darkness. Okay, so we can add a little bit of a regular part there off the edge. And I like this area too, it's quite nice and dark. And it's going to be just living right underneath the words, so we can emphasize that a little bit more. Okay. And then when you're going to do your next one, you just do it inside the other one, a little bit smaller, a little bit smaller. And then we can do it on the other side. Just kind of random. And a little bit smaller. And they don't have to join, like they're just going to wisp off and fall into each other there. I'm trying to hold it so you guys can see it. And anywhere that's a little bit dark, just try to anything pretty simple, eh? You can always make one look like it's off the edge there. And then let's just put like little random circle darkness in the very middles. Add to it. How do you feel? Like, take a look at some wood pieces when you're doing this. And just try to mimic. And just a little bit of a glaze through the words there, so there'll be some depth in there. Okay, so I might have went over my words a little bit, so if you did, you can always try to let this dry. But I'm trying to stay away from them, so you shouldn't have any problems. So just try to stay away from them a little bit. Or you can always choose to put your pattern on now after this stage is done. But I'm a little bit cocky sometimes. I like to get it on there. See where I want to work. Where do I want to complement those words is why I want to put my pattern in before. You can just barely see the tops there of my writing there, so hopefully you can see the tops of yours too. Like I said, I'm not doing too many. Just enough to highlight it and shadow it, right? Add just randomness, here and there. And then if you have any areas that are too dark, this is where, if you want to do the reverse, the same thing with some white now. And you don't want a lot of white. You don't want it to look white, so you could use the antique white, or vintage white, I should say. So just rinse your brush so it's really clean. And then do the same thing where you're just going to pick up a little tiny bit of white. Yeah, so you're just going to do the same kind of trick and float a little bit of solid white on the very edge. Okay. And where you're going to just highlight it is just underneath any dark areas. And you're going to just wash this basically right out with your brush. So I have lots of floating medium in that corner. So sometimes I'll put just little streaks in there, but it's too light. I'll just soften it with the back of my brush. And you really don't need any white as far as I'm concerned. You know, you just tiny little bits. If you feel like it's too dark, you know, you can just add a few interesting highlight areas here and there. But very subtle, like you want it to wash out. Okay, lots of floating medium. And because I'm using the real white right now, so it's really bright. So I would suggest that you pick up the vintage, right? Where is it? There we go. So if you use the vintage white, which I'm going to use on my letters, but you can use any color for your letters. If you want to use black or blue or green or, you know, whatever your favorite color is, you can change them all up, okay? So this is where I would start putting all my words on. Okay. A little bit of wet spot there. Okay. And I just use a script liner. Okay. We're just going to play around a little bit on some paper to show you some tricks with the script liner. So what I do sometimes is I just use the floating medium or a little bit of water to dampen my brush a bit. And then I will take a little tiny bit of that paint to the side and I'll just water it down a little bit. Okay, just so that it's a little bit easier to stroke, but you don't want to water it down too much because with the whites, a lot of times when you're doing the words, you might even go over this 3 times just to make sure that you got the coverage that you're looking for. Okay, so hopefully it won't be too runny, but it's going to be enough that you can move your brush around a little bit. And for me, playing around on top of a font like this, it actually has made me push myself to try to do it on my own too. So if you want to try and make your own letters, okay, it's all about pushing and pulling your brush. Okay, so you could try and do this with, okay, so I'm just loading it right up, a little bit pressure, really thin line, and then push on your way up, and then pop up on your chisel, and give it a little curl. Okay, and this is your little extra bonus. Alright, so when I do my E, I'll start off a little bit on my point, and then halfway around the top of the E, that's when you start putting a little bit more pressure all the way around the side. Okay, and then a little bit up. So this is basically how you do a C too. Okay. I'm trying to do it nice and slow so you guys can see. And a little bit lower there. And sometimes I'll help it. You don't have to do it all in one stroke. And then I'll just close her up. Okay. And again, the L. That's what I like about this font is because it's very much like the same font that you would, same pressure that you would use with your brush to create. See that? So if you are doing a freehand, then I would highly suggest you use a ruler to help guide you a little bit. Okay. And then again, the same thing with our C. Okay, push. And we can make our C's a little bit different than our. Okay, and then sometimes if you don't get a good point, then you have to kind of go from the top and then just close it in from the top. Okay. I'll make that a little bit wider. Okay, and then our O's are pretty standard. Just little circles. Okay, and sometimes again there's a spot that you have to stop when you're doing circles. You can always start at the top and work your way down into that little thin area. And that gives you a nice little interesting top too. Okay, and then our M's. Okay, we're going to do our little bit of a starting point, push down, pop up. So depending on where you want this to go. Start off really high up on your chisel and slowly push down to make your M. N, M, all of them. Stop right there for your M. Stop at the top if you're doing an R. Okay? Very, very similar. And push. So I'm just doing these randomly just so that I'm showing you the strokes, right? Some of them are a little bit bigger than others, but you'll stay focused when you have a little bit of a guideline. Right? So you don't have to copy mine exactly, but at least it's your guideline to get you started. And then you can erase this graphite paper off your wood after as well. Okay, and then our E again. And I'm telling you, I've done some lettering, and some words have 3 E's in them, and it's driven me crazy to try to get them all exactly the same. But with some practice, right, they'll look similar. And when you do something like this, you know, it's nice to show that it is, you know, handmade. Okay, so did you like that little bit of a lesson with doing freehand letters? Practice the whole alphabet. And if you need more help with liner practice, the whole course number 3 that I have for in the intro to one stroke, I show you how to double load these brushes and everything in it. Okay. So if you're not feeling comfortable, you can just color this all in too, and use my little template to fill it right up. Okay, so obviously this is a lot bigger than 2 brushes, so push over and make it a little bit wider. Okay, so that's how I try to do my letters when I'm, so it'll help you practice getting the shape of them using the stencil. That little curl on the top. You probably have to do 2 coats, like I said. Just try to go over it quickly and not too many times, because sometimes you end up pulling the paint right off. So 2 thin coats are often better than 1 thick coat, or even 3 thin coats are better than 2 really thick coats. A little bit wider. Really push yourself to try to learn how to do them freehand. I hope you guys have some nice music in the background there. It's so nice and quiet here, but it might be too quiet for you. If you have any areas that you don't like, that it made too wide, just take a clean, damp brush and just erase anything that you don't like. Fix it up. I do a lot of erasing. I love erasing, I think. Like, I don't even worry about things sometimes. Now, mind you, if you have to erase in between here, then it might be a little bit tricky. And I've sometimes messed up a whole letter and I just erase the whole letter, start over. I think that's your easier way to do it. And you'll see these are not the same. It's because I did this original one freehand. I just kept playing with my letters until I was happy with them. Okay, so something like that. Oh, I didn't finish my top here properly. Wait till it's really, really good and dry, and then you can always erase any lines that are still showing. Okay, so I don't worry about the lines or covering them. I just use them as markers. Just be careful peeling your tape off. This is a real cheap dollar stuff, so it doesn't even stick. And then keep your template for another day for another project. Of course, I put too much paint on. Now you can go over your second coats after you put your background design on too. So you can just at least get the first coat on if you want. If you really want to, take your time, let this dry, do another coat now. But what I usually do is I let it dry and then I come back to it. And I start putting on my leaves, and I want my paint to stay fresh, so I'll pop that back in there. So I only need a few colors. If you want to add a few flowers to this, you guys can. You know, change it into a Christmas design. I have some poinsettias that I've already done in the course that you guys can always put also on here and make it more of a Christmas theme. But I find this is just like an easy one that's simple and it's good for all year long. It's not going to be anything specific, you know, it covers all year round. So whatever dark green you have, a thicket or a sap. I'm running low on sap. I'm waiting for more paint. Happy green or lime green you could use for the light green. You can always use a little bit of yellow and white. I do add a titch of yellow daffodil here and there just to brighten the odd leaf up, just to make it look a little bit different. Just a tiny little bit of yellow. And you can always even add a little bit of burnt umber into your thicket to give it a little bit more, a deeper color leaf too. Just that little tiny titch. So depending on how big your sign is, I think I use a 16 or a 12 to do my design. So again, it depends on how big you want your leaves. If you need to practice on it with your brush on a dry brush, spread it right out, and that'll be how fat your leaf is going to be. Okay, so if you don't feel like you want your brush to be that fat, move down to another brush size. Okay, so this is a 12, and I spread that right out. That'll be the maximum of that brush. Okay, you start up on the chisel, and then you push, and then you pop up to your chisel again, right? So I always found that to be a good little trick to kind of guide me if I wasn't sure how big do I want it. And if you still feel like that's too big, move down to a size 10. Okay, so you just have to make a lot more of them if they're smaller. But I always like to put a couple big ones here and there, and then lay some smaller ones. So you can even use a number 8, or so you'll be using a variety of sizes. But I always like to fool around on with my brush to make it the smallest and the largest it can possibly be. Okay, and it all depends on pressure. So I'm going to use this little paper here again. And I will add this paper to your next e-pack too. I just want to put something a little bit heavier on top of it so my towel is too spongy. Okay. So just to recap on your one-stroke leaf, okay, you always have a starter and an end point. And somewhere in the middle is where you're going to be the fattest. Okay, so depending on how fat you want it, you can do slight pressure, pop up and make it even smaller. You can slide that slight pressure along and make it skinny and long. Or you can really start to push on it and make it really fat and slide it on. Okay, so it really just depends on how much pressure do you put, okay, to really spread those bristles out. And if you don't have enough floating medium, if it's feeling dry and if you feel any kind of resistance at all, you won't be able to spread that brush out to its maximum size. Okay. So really small little, just using the chisel just to draw your line. Okay, practice that a little bit, because that's how we put our little veins in the middle. Right? So it's just simple little leaves. Depending on how you start them and push them really down and over to the side, they'll look like they're flopping down. Okay. Flopping up, you're really curling them up. So it's have some variety in them. And like I said, you can always add just that titch of burnt umber in there, and that gives it a darker look. And then you can always add a titch of yellow into your green, and that'll brighten it up too. And this is just with a dirty brush. You already had a bunch of them made, and you're not going to clean your brush. You're just going to add another little bit of brown, a little bit of yellow, and it'll change that whole next leaf. If you want to get back to those bright greens, then yes, you're going to have to really rinse your brush back out, and maybe even find a new spot to make your gradient. Okay, so that way you can get that clean green look again. Okay, once you dirty your little pile, you want to make sure some of them are really clean, then have one little pile for and then you're just going to downsize and do a bunch of different sizes. So if you want your design to come off this way or that way or underneath, like you could always, and you're really depending on my pattern, you can always use the sheet upside down just to put the pattern part now. You know, obviously you're going to do the words that way, but then just take your pattern off and put it on the bottom part if you really want to do it that way. And so you can reverse the pattern a little bit into section parts. So the first thing you want to do is just float on your chisel to create those little main veins. So you have one maybe floating up that way, and then this one floated away this way. Okay, this is the end of the leaf, so we don't have to go all the way to the bottom there. And then I turn my brush around to float it the other way. And then this one here can come in and just underneath our little, so if you want to pop that E back on top of your branch again after, you can fix it very easily. Or you can even just erase, you know, anything that is on the E right now. Just erase it and it'll make it look like it's behind the E. So that's my little trick on how I pop things back out. Instead of trying to keep adding paint, erase. Alright, that's what I do. Okay, so then we can just start deciding if you want to put in a couple of leaves. In my e-pack, I started putting in some of the pine needles now. Right, so you can start putting a bunch of those, and it's just all kinds of little chisels here and there. And you start with your dark on the outside, and then flip your brush around so that you're start putting your light in, and that'll help highlight them. Okay, and then if you want to add a little bit of white in there, you can always add a few light ones. And you see how I was very heavy-handed there? Not a problem. Okay, just erase. And once this background is dry really good, and if you use multi-surface paint, you're going to have no problem erasing at all. Okay. And we're going to layer some leaves on there and do different, you know, layering effect a little bit. If you want to even just have the picture of the pattern there to kind of guide you, where did I put things? Okay. And then you can always put, if you go in this way, I really like this little knot here, so I'm going to attempt to leave that there. And just easy little flips, and then some later ones. And we'll put some over on this way. Altogether, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe. I flipped that one a little bit inside there. Always have a little one here. Every time I do it, it's always slightly different, and that's why I like doing them freehand. I'm not a photocopier. And you're not a printer. It doesn't look like you used one of those machines and printed it. You can always add a few more white highlights on later too, after you have your leaves on there and you feel like you want to add a few more strokes into certain areas to pop them up. You know, I always find that it always comes together nicely if I just get the base of it going. And then I can always go over it again once it's dry and add, you know, more dimension to it, or add a little bit more highlights to it. It's never done until you say it's done. So just kind of a little bit long, make them look interesting. Just even a few wispy ones. Miss Molly, she wants to jump on the desk. You don't want to be here. Please go away. Mommy, please. Okay, so then now I can put my last leaves, my big leaves there, or if you want to leave that for a smaller leaf, you can always add a smaller leaf there. I did them all pretty much with the same size brush and just added a couple. And go out this way. And then you can always add your little branches to them after too. When you do your little centers. Your little... Molly! You guys want to visit Molly? Where are you, girl? Miss Molly. This is my little Miss Molly. What's the matter? You lonely? Daddy's not talking to you? Oh, Mommy. He's such a suck. Come on, I want to join you. Nope, I gotta kick you out. You got our face right in there. No! Don't want to leave. Do you not understand that we're in a live conference? Alrighty. Call Molly. Alright, sorry about that. Maybe you thought it was cute, I don't know. Okay, so let's get back to painting. So you can see you can let your leaves dry and get a little nicer coverage on them too if you don't get the right coverage the first time. And then I can turn it around too if I really want this to look like it's flipping up. You can move your piece around, make your life easier. If it's easier for you. Because this is going all in the one direction, so I just put in a couple, but I try to make room for my acorns too, right? So I have one acorn that's going to be somewhere in there, and then I have another one that's going to come in underneath, and then the other one's going to come in on the outside. Maybe I'll try and make it a little bit lower here. Okay. We're just putting in a couple starter leaves, and then I come back and I put more leaves in after I do my acorns. And so you can put a little bit of an interesting couple leaves underneath the words. Just a few here and there. And then when you go to do, if you need to do a second coat on your leaf, that's where sometimes I'll change that up. And when I do the second coat, I'll add some brown to it. And then, or I'll add some yellow to it, just to brighten it up a little bit. You know, so the first time I go over it all, I just stick with my general sap and citrus green. And then if I have to do a second coat over them, that's when I decide if I want to add a different tone to them. So I think that's enough leaves to get us started. I always like to make sure that I have my leaves the way I want them before, if I wanted to layer another leaf on top of this, then I would definitely want to make sure that I'm happy with this leaf. Right. And it stands out a lot nicer. And then if you want on the second coat, you can always add just a little bit of white or vintage white. And then just add a few highlights to a couple. Alright, so you can make a lot of different variations in your leaves by just adding a tiny little bit of different tone. Well, this one I did upside down, so I have to follow that again. Okay, we can get some variation. Alright, so some have a little yellow, some just have green, some have a little white, some have a little bit of brown. It's very easy to pop that in and change that. See how I made that one more brown? Alrighty, so now we definitely want to downsize for the acorns. If you want to use an 8 or a 6, depending on how big you want to make them. Okay, so in my little e-pack, I probably used even a 6. Okay. So I give you some practice that have both 8 and 6s in it. So sometimes it's easier just to practice with a bigger brush and then downsize yourself to the smaller. Ready, so your little 6. And that's just basically with your burnt umber. And I actually do use white for, just so it's a little bit brighter. You could use the vintage if you really wanted to. But I wanted it to be a little bit brighter than the words too, right? You're basically going to double load your brush. Okay, but when you're working with a tiny little 6, it's easier to go side to side. All right, so that's how you blend your tiny little 6s. And you want like a 3/4 blend. You want to have a lot more brown on your brush than you do white. And after a while, this is going to start getting dirty white. It's going to get used and softened, and you're going to keep doing strokes, and all of a sudden it's not going to be bright white anymore. And in fact, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, so sometimes you start off and it's too bright. So you want to pretend like you did about 3 or 4 strokes and you come back and now it's starting to be an off-white on your gradient. Okay, so the trick is before you do every stroke, you're going to, oh, I'm not liking this lighting tonight. Before you make every stroke, you're going to pick up a tiny little bit of a ball of white, so then that way you can get that nice light highlight right at the top. Okay, so you definitely want like a 3/4 gradient is the trick of this. Okay. So let's see, where do we want to start them? So usually what I suggest you do to get you going is just to start with your base. Where do you want your base? So you have a little bit of a stem, and then you're going to just paint in a little bit of a triangle shape. Okay, so if there's little streaks of white here and there, that's okay. Okay, so it's just going to give you a base to work towards. How wide do I want my acorn? All right. And then we're going to come down and put another one a little bit more over here. So we have a little bit of a stem and then our V shape. This one here, we're going to put going off into this direction. Okay, so his stem's going to be here, and then that'll focus you on that one. Okay, so it's okay if there's like those streaky marks, because we're going to go over this again too. It's just like putting a little base in there and a guide. Okay, so now you can see how you lost your white probably by now, which is not a bad thing. So just move over. If you're getting too dark, move over to the side, keep adding white, and move over to the side. Okay, and then if you have to go in, refresh your dark, you're just going to keep moving your gradient pile out, so then that way you can keep control over it, or you're going to just grab a new section and make a new gradient pile. Okay, stay out of your floating medium. But every single time that you do a stroke, you got to pick up that tiniest little ball of white paint on the end. So then that way you're highlighting and shadowing and blending all at the same time. Okay, so it's usually good to work your way down, because if I did this one first and then try to do this one, there's a good chance I'm going to stick my hand in it. So you try to work in a way where you're going to stay out of your work. Okay, so you kind of give yourself how many rows do you want to make. Right? How many brush sizes do you have? 1, 2, maybe 3. Okay, just to get you started if you want to have a marker. But you're going to overlap this, so there could be more rows, but I'm just trying to give you a guide. How far up do you want to go? Okay. So this is at the top here. We can start off with one little U stroke. And if you've done roses before, that's basically the back petal of a rosebud. Right? And if your gradient isn't high enough, then that's where I suggest make sure you have that on par before you move down. Okay, so if you have to go over it again, just to raise that gradient up a little bit, or maybe you have to go over it again to add just a titch more highlight to it. Okay, you're going to have that opportunity to do that now before you keep going. Okay, because there's no way of fixing anything that you overlap. Okay, so the next one is going to be like brick layered. You're putting 2 on the next one. Right? And just make sure you're happy with it. Then you move down and you can put 3. Okay, so again, brick layering. And then 1 right in the middle of the 2. Okay. Fix your gradients on your plate every once in a while. Tip with a little bit of white. Okay. And then we have the top of our acorn. Then we can do a little bit of a twist to it. So this one is going to go out to like 11 o'clock. And then this one's going to go out to like 1 o'clock. So you try to just do a little bit of an angle on it. Okay. And then you can fill up the middle. I'm in my floating medium again. And when you're dealing with a small little brush, you see how it's getting all yicky on the back? My brown is getting uncontrolled. It's getting all gloopy. Just wipe it out on a towel and start over. But you don't have to rinse it, per se. You just add a little bit of floating medium to wake up what your brush is doing. Right? Because when you go and put it in water, you have no control over it. So I have just that tiny little bit of floating medium just to dampen my brush again. And then I'll fix my gradient again. And sometimes you have to do that a little bit more often with a smaller brush. I used to be a nail artist, so I'm used to painting on tiny little nails. So you know, that's part of how I find this is a little bit maybe easy for me, but it is a little bit practice, right? And everything you do, you should be able to do in any size brush, I always say. Okay, so we can always add 2 more there. Okay. And then again, we're just going to go slightly out. Slightly out. This one just is your guide, kind of like to make it look a little bit interesting. And then just fill it up. So you're just going to keep going now. You don't need to go any wider. Right? So you should be hitting the base of your little one that you made earlier. Right? And then I usually come down one. That's how I do them now. So if it looks proportioned with 3, leave 3. If you feel like it needs 4, then you know, add a little one to the side. Just don't go as wide. And then when I go over to fix anything, I put my hand in green paint tonight. This is where I try to make this last stroke a little longer. So when you go over it again, come down into your base. So you're just exaggerating the length. Okay. You just come down and come down. That just kind of adds a little bit of interesting. And if there's anything that you don't like off to the side, you can always throw a little bit of a leaf. Okay. And you can always fix your stem and go over this little area. We're going to put a little leaf on there. And then just repeat. Okay, so I want this one to kind of come in. And you'll see sometimes I just tip my brush and I don't even pick up any more brown. I just go keep picking up more white. Right? I actually have enough white on there I can probably do 2. Right? And then every once in a while I'll go and refresh on my plate. Smallest amount of floating medium. Right? Sometimes you're lucky enough, but usually I have to go back and fix things. Add a little bit more white to it. So you definitely want basically all brown on your brush with just a very little bit of white. And depending on their view, like if it's pointing up or pointing to the side, they're all going to look slightly different. So some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter and chubbier. That's okay. Okay, so this is why I usually start on this direction and work out like a lefty. And then out to the side. I always find that once I get to this point, if I do my outside ones, then it's easier for me to stay focused on filling in the center. And we'll put one there. So remember, these ones, our last ones, are going to be a little bit longer in a stride. Just a little bit. And go a little bit bigger too as you get to the bottom. And green on there. And this one's going to tip off to the edge. You can almost feel in your brush that you still have lots of paint. You just need that freshness on the edge. There you go. There's 3 little acorns. So we can just add a few smaller leaves now. Make them look a little bit interesting. You can always add a few more, out this way if you want to. Just make them your own. Fill up your space depending on how big your board is. But typically your leaf highlights are on top, but you can make them in different directions just so they stand out differently when you're working all with the same color. I could have put another little one here too, if I wanted to, because this, like I said, this one's a little bit bigger than my original. But we can just fill it all up with more leaves, and then what I can do too is to just make them my little acorn or my little pine needles. I can always bring them back a little bit further. If you have some room, you want to so just spread it out. And I can always put these back on top of the acorn a little bit, add just a little bit of white into it, and then it'll stand out. And layer some of your leaves over each other, makes it look a little bit interesting. Make sure you don't have these big globs behind. Just it there. There we go. You see how I just clean that out a little bit? Okay. A few more little wisps here and there. And sometimes I always like to add just a little bit of, if I'm putting a leaf on top of a leaf, I'll add just a little bit more white onto that layering leaf. So then that way it looks like it's actually in front. Okay. Go over things. And if you wanted to add even some curly cues, you could add, if you feel comfortable with some curly cues, you can always add a few of those. And add a few more pine needles here if it feels like it's naked in any area. And the very last strokes are just a little smidgen of white. So they feather kind of right over the leaves after. Softens things up a little bit. And even if you just want to add a couple sprigs here and there, you know, you don't have to do the whole big one. Just to soften some bare areas up if you feel like it's too naked. And then I did some coming out that way too. Put that leaf right on top again. Want it to sit on top. A little bit of white. My white is getting a little bit thick, so once it's sitting there for a little while. I hope you guys have seen my hacks that I have. I have a few hacks that'll help you with dealing with thick paint. Okay. To that one. Now you can layer, so you can see the back ones I were going in one direction, and then I added some in the other direction. Too light, add some dark ones. Too light, dark, add some light ones. Just slightly go over your little acorn a little bit if you want. Give it some greenery at the base of it. Little wisps. So hopefully I've made this one even better than the last one. So it's too light there a little bit at the edge. You can always go over it again if you're not happy with the opacity is what we call it, or the tone of it. And you can always go over it again. Okay, so I'm doing a little bit more yellow on that one. This one is pretty faint looking. Okay, so then when you're finally finished doing all your leaves and everything's all nice and dry, that's when you can float in a few of your veins now. This one's not very much coverage. So you see, every time I go and I blend back into my palette again, or you can hear it if you can't see it, I keep going back and refreshing my brush, because as soon as you go like this, you end up wrecking your gradient. So when you're doing your stems, you gotta fix your gradient every single time for every single stem. Okay? You'll see by fooling around on paper that if you try to do it maybe 3 or 4 times, you know, maybe you might be able to get a couple, but you'll end up losing your gradient. Alright, so but really just using the light side of your chisel. If your leaf is really, really light, then go in with the other direction, so then that way it follows through with the dark, so that you can actually see the dark. So every leaf is going to be a little bit different depending on how you did it, how you loaded it. So just remember, you may have to move your brush from dark, flip it over, or do it into the light, or into the dark. Okay, so that'll give you different looks. Okay, I'll show you a little bit more on paper. We haven't really did too many veins in here. You can always add a little bit more white into your vein too than you did in your original leaf. So then that way it stands out a little bit more, right? Just a tiny bit lighter. Okay, so if your leaf is really lots of light color, let's see if I can make a really light leaf for you. Okay, so this one is going to be a lot more light and just a trace of dark at the bottom. So then you want to make sure, following with your dark. Okay, it just depends on how you see perspective. Some people say you're leading with the light, and some people say you're following with the dark. So it really means the same thing, doesn't it? Okay. So I don't want to confuse you, but play around. You'll see when you have your dark, it'll be more of a dark little vein. And if you flip your brush around and do it with the light, you should get a light vein. Okay, so if this is a dark leaf, we want it to look a little bit lighter. Okay, a little bit lighter through that one. Can you see how that pops out nicely when you change the direction? Okay, so just play around, and you know, you can always do it and change your mind. Oh, that didn't work. Flip your brush around and go over it again. Right? And then it'll come out lighter. So just reverse your brush around and play around, and you'll get the same way you did all those little pine needles. Right? You're starting off dark. Right? And if it's giving you dry spots like that, it means your paint's starting to get too thick, especially when you're practicing on paper. Okay. You see, I ran out of my nice gray cardstock there. I've been doing so many practice sheets there, and I can't get out to anywhere to get any. Restock my paper supplies. Alrighty, so it gives you a little bit of insight on the hand painted ones, because that's probably the only thing I didn't put in the other video was that little extra part about the hand, you know, pressing down and lifting up on your chisel to create your letters. So that's maybe a little bit vague in your e-pack, because it's kind of hard to write out instructions with that. So I'm hoping that this little extra part of the video will help you, but just know that course number 3 in my intro, even though you might have been doing one stroke for a while, if you haven't jumped on that one, it has so many different exercises on how to play with your liner brush, and I have push flowers in there, and I've got, again, all just liner roses. I've got all kinds of different exercises that'll keep you popping just with a liner brush, and that's all in number 3. So I do go over the letters a little bit in that class as well again, and how to do a lot of different effects as well. So yeah, if you want to add a few curlicues, you know, you could always add that. That wasn't in my original design, but basically we want to make sure that our paint is going to be very watery and inky, so that you're able to get that really light line. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit translucent. That's okay. But if you don't have enough water in there, you won't be able to make your little curlicues. Right? And you don't want a big blob on the end, right? So you just want enough paint that you got good coverage, but you still can see that little bit of a point. Right? And then just up on your chisel like a pen. Play around, going back and forth. And just cover your whole paper up until you run out of paint. And just get into that flow of helping your liner brush dance. Okay, so you can just make little odd, little random up and down movements in the beginning, and then as you feel comfortable, then you can start going like you're writing the letter E, and then slowly work your way backwards and just play with them. And the more you play with your liner brush, in the different directions, the more they're going to get more interesting and loosen up. Okay, so you can always throw a few of those in your design as well. Start off from the base somewhere, and just little ones. And it can even just be some random dry, like little essays, just some simple. Hey, and if you don't like it, if everything else is dry in the back, and you don't like that, just erase it. If you're quick, you'll be able to erase it, gone, and then try again. Okay, so maybe we decide, oh, well, I don't like that one. Maybe it doesn't need to be out that far. Just a few little interesting ones here and there. But I don't want to cover our faux wood. And of course, the last thing you might want to put is your little signature. So a lot of times I'm using my business name and instead of putting my full name, you can put your initials. Like if you have a middle name, you can put your 3 initials. Or mine is Mandy's Creative Touch. So I'll put it in tiny there. But if I was giving this away for a gift, then I would put, my full name, the date, and everything all on the back. So just enough to sneak your little signature in there. I think that's good. Sometimes less is more. We don't want to go too much, right? Because we still want to keep that focus. Now, of course, if you want to finish this now, you're going to let this dry overnight at least, okay, before you spray it. There's a lot of different veneers out there that you can get. There's some that are Mod Podge makes one. Donna has one. This one here is just from our hardware store. This is something that people use outdoor on their decks and wooden furniture outside. And this is what I actually use pretty much on anything. Whether it's indoor or outdoor, I still buy the outdoor version because I feel like it's just going to give me that much more protection. If on the road something gets dusty and you want to wash it off, so you can do that on your wood pieces, no problem. Okay, and then I even spray my canvases down too, if I want to give it that little extra protection or like to give it a nice shine, because maybe your paints are different shines. If you have a variety of paints, you have the multi-surface, you have some that might be enamel, then you might have some that are just a regular version. You're going to have some dull spots and shiny spots on your painting because they dry differently, because there's actually sealer inside this. Okay, so there has been times where I don't even seal it. If you're doing it inside and you're using the multi-surface paint, you're not going to even need a sealer, right, with this paint. But if you have a few colors in this particular version of the paint, it's just a regular version, there's no sealer in here, you're going to notice the sheen difference too. So sometimes just doing a quick spray over it with some lacquer of some sort, with maybe gloss, or this one's satin, you don't want it too shiny, then at least it'll keep everything all the same shine, and it'll look a little bit more like a finished piece that is done with protection on it. Okay. So it just depends on what you like. If you want semi-gloss or matte satin, they call it, or high gloss. And then that will really finish it. So definitely, now you can go over your words, do the second, third coat. And once your paint is really good and dry, it's going to be easy for you to go in and just erase all those little pencil marks. Okay, so sometimes I'll even do that before I do my second coat. And then that way I can just pop up that paint Yeah, that'll be no problem. Wherever the paint is covering, it won't erase. But if it's popping out, you'll be able to erase it. And then here I had a couple lines that I'd ever used. Yeah, I mean, it always looks better when you erase all this stuff. So I'll play around and do a second coat on my words, and then I'll take a nice picture of it, and then I'll share it with you guys in the group.